Okay. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm Beth Harpaz, and I'm here tonight to host a conversation with Glenn Lewis. He's a CUNY journalism professor, a veteran journalist, and the author of a terrific new biography about the legendary boxer Smokin Joe Frazier. The book is called Sparring with Smokin Joe, Joe Frazier's epic battles and rivalry with Ali. And obviously, Frazier's epic rivalry with Muhammad Ali is a big part of the story. But the book also offers a nuanced portrait of Frazier, and it raises important questions about whether his career was perhaps unfairly defined by Ali and by the animosity between them. We'll talk about that, of course, along with some of the other threads in the book, including Frazier's surprising side gig as a singer in a band, and his attempt to groom his son Marvis for a boxing career, which didn't quite pan out. Glenn Lewis is on the faculty of CUNY's Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, where he teaches nonfiction book writing. He also runs the journalism program at York College, which he created. Welcome, Professor Lewis. How are you doing tonight?
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, really. Me too. So I know nothing about boxing, but I loved the book. Obviously, the Muhammad Ali stuff is endlessly interesting, and we'll definitely get to that. I'm sure our audience is going to want to talk about that. But before, I want to start by pointing out that this is not a straightforward chronological biography. You don't begin with Frazier's hardscrabble childhood. He grew up on a farm in the Jim Crow South, one of 13 children, poor family. Instead, you start in 1980. Frazier's 36 years old, retired from boxing. He's got a gym in North Philadelphia, and he's grooming his son Marvis for a boxing career. Tell us why you began the book there and how you crafted the structure of your narrative. And, you know, I'd ask my listeners to bear in mind that you teach nonfiction book writing, so structure of this book is something that was really important to you.
Well, actually, it turned out to be the perfect place to begin the book. And the decision-making process actually sounds like a mini tutorial in book organization, nonfiction book organization. The first thing that I did was to decide how can I structure a tight time frame for the book. Where do I have to begin to have that tight time frame introduced? And of course, the time frame runs from the first scene in the book through the climax of the book. All right. So the book begins in March 1980 with an interview with Joe Frazier up in his gym. And I'm discussing Muhammad Ali coming out of retirement a year later in 1981 to fight Larry Holmes for the heavyweight championship. And Joe is considering coming out about that same time for a comeback fight of his own. So that right away set up the time frame for the book. And of course, later on in the book, we cover those comeback fights, and they're a very important part of the book. From that, we also had to look at, or I had to look at, where is the part of the book that lends itself to firsthand reporting, because you need that sense of immediacy. All right. So I realized that the time frame, again, worked perfect for firsthand reporting. That was the months that I would have unlimited access to Joe and Marvis and members of their inner circle while I did the reporting. So I would be on the road, in the gym, at different fights with them, and I would constantly be able to chronicle in real time what they were doing. And that more intimate reporting would also allow me to find triggers to work in the landscape of the story. And the landscape of the story is whatever comes before or after the time frame. So what I did was I worked in different conversations, different scenes that would lend itself to transitioning me into stories about Joe's childhood in the South, Joe's earlier career and the 3 fights with Ali and the rest of his career, and also Marvis's later boxing career and where he was successful and where he failed. And all of that seemed to work well together. And the final component was that the intimate reporting lent itself to personal comment, the commentary, and to analysis. And so those are the 4 elements that you want to sort of have in place when you're deciding where to start a book.
Now, did you have the idea for this in the back of your head all these years that someday you were going to turn those 1980 interviews into a book, or did something happen that planted the seed? And did you actually save your notes and your tapes for 40 years in, I assume a New York City apartment with no closets?
You know, the thing that's amazing is I actually had a closet dedicated to my notes,
Okay.
with envelopes piled up floor to ceiling in the closet, with 40 years of articles and notes from articles. And I, about 3 years ago, started to take that closet apart and empty it in search of this material
Wow.
and to get started on the book.
Okay,
And
this is like I don't know. It's a tale for every pack rat journalist in the city of New York, right?
But what really turned out to be amazing is the absolute last envelope at the bottom of the last pile was the envelope that contained 20 hours of transcripts
Of
and
course.
my reporter's notes, and they were in sync with the transcripts. So they led to me creating a lot of fully realized scenes
Yeah.
with the reporting, with the original reporting. And that's what encouraged me to do the book.
Yeah, I have to say, that those scenes are extremely memorable, and they really do feel like you were like it happened yesterday and you're right in the room, listening to this conversation. All right, let's talk about Muhammad Ali.
Oh,
Everybody knows him, anti-establishment hero for people of color and, other people too. He was cool. He rejected his slave name, Cassius Clay. He became a Muslim. He went to jail rather than going to Vietnam. A lot of people recently saw the Ken Burns documentary. So this is all very fresh in, the minds of a lot of people out there. But in your book, he comes off as a total first-class jerk. So tell us about some of the awful things that Ali said and did to Frasier. What was that about?
well, look, before I get to that, I have to be fair about this. I started out following, Ali and Frasier, and I was an absolute Ali fan. I was passionate about Ali winning, the fights with Frasier. I wanted him to kill him in those fights. I was a draft age young man in my 20s, and Ali represented my causes. He cared about the Vietnam draft. He preached against it. He was a community leader for the Black community, and he said all the right things in making them feel more empowered, and that was important at that time. So I really admired his politics. I admired his stick-to-itiveness in protesting the draft. He fought the system and won. However, when I started to interview Joe and I got to know him, and he became more comfortable with me, I started to realize the impact that Ali's jokes and Ali's comments, which entertained me and millions of other people at that time, were anything but entertaining, and how much damage he had done to Joe's life long term.
Yeah, give us a couple of examples give us the worst thing.
Well, all right, look, first of all, the proof of the things he did, the proof of the damage that he did, I found when I traveled with Joe to Augusta, Georgia in 1980, and that's about 100 miles from where he grew up in South Carolina. So he was playing in black clubs and white clubs. When he was playing
And this is when he was traveling with his band
with his band,
as a singer.
exactly. And he was playing in black clubs where he had a lot of poor farmers, his people, coming to the shows, and he purposely did those shows for them because he wanted them to know that he cared. And you could see the remnants of the Ali comments during those shows because there were members of the audience that would be yelling things out the whole time. You know, what about Ali? What about your selling out your people? What about, you know, standing up for the Black community and stuff like that? And he was reliving Ali's insults all over again in these crowds. When we went to the white clubs, the more affluent white clubs, they adored him. They saw Ali as sort of anti-white at that time. He was preaching separation of races, and they took offense to that, I guess. And they saw Joe as like the person that was even-handed about that and got along with both races, and they were highly complimentary. Well, if you go back and you look at some of the comments that Ali used about Frasier, he set himself up as the Black man's champion. He referred to himself as the Black man's champion when he was promoting the fights, with the suggestion that that made him a protector of the Black people, and Joe was the white man's champion. And he referred to Joe as the white man's champion, which strongly suggested that Joe was a traitor to his race, had sold out the Black community to the white establishment, and was everything you could, you know, abhor in somebody at that time, including calling him an Uncle Tom. And, you know, that kind of labeling that Ali did lasted longer than just the name calling or the jokes or the poems. You know, and also he referred to himself as a superior Black man. And he would talk about how pretty he was, talked about his light skin, talked about his features, talked about how intelligent he was. When he talked about Joe, he talked about Joe as an inferior Black man. And he would suggest that he was ignorant, that he smelled awful. He compared him to different animals. He talked about his dark features and his, you know, his obviously Negroid features, as if they were something for him to be ashamed about. And he used the most racist terms I ever heard one Black man use about another. So there's no wonder that stayed with Joe for a long, long time.
Right. I mean, who could blame him for being scarred and, you know, tormented by this treatment? Do you think the purses for their fights would have been as big if not for the name calling? And at the end of the day, do you think part of what was going on was Ali taunting Frasier, you know, partly because the hype added to the payday, or was this demonization part of how he psyched himself up? I mean, what, you know, I know the book is about Frasier, you know, you didn't go to psychoanalyze Ali, but what's your take on what was going on in
Oh,
Ali's
no, I
head?
mean, there's no guessing about this. First of all, I asked Fraser some of those questions exactly. And one of the things he said to me that was interesting about the fight of the century, the fight of the century transcended sports, and it transcended just the sporting event. it was a phenomenon. It was a political turning point and a financial turning point for heavyweight boxing in our era. It was one of the most lucrative sporting events in history. It was watched by 1 million people. It was the first sporting event to be covered by closed circuit TV worldwide. And Ali claimed that he was doing this, insulting act in order to sell out, the closed circuit television and to sell out the Garden. Well, the truth was the Garden was sold out from the minute they offered tickets. The television money was there in advance. They sold out worldwide closed circuit TVs. So all these reasons he gave for doing this were already a fact. Plus, they were guaranteed, both of them, of getting $2.5 million for the fight. So no matter how many tickets they sold, they would get $2.5 million for the fight. So the argument didn't hold up. I think Ali saw a chance. He was coming back after a long time being away. He had to reestablish his sort of act, so to speak, in his place in the Black community. And he wanted to create certain solid images for himself. And he figured the best way to do that was to have a clear divide between him and Joe. If he represents the Black community, Joe has to represent the white community. He needed him to be the clear enemy in this situation. And it was unfortunate because they were best of friends when they started out. They worked out together. Joe offered him money when they revoked his license. And Joe spoke out for him publicly and defended his avoiding the draft. One of the first people in the boxing community to do that. So I think Joe was doubly offended by the fact that this was done by a friend.
Yeah, I mean, you write about that very eloquently, and it's like the heart of a tragedy that is part of your narrative. That Frazier lobbied boxing authorities to let Ali back in the ring after he was banned. He loaned him money at one point, and he felt utterly betrayed by the way Ali treated him. I mean, it's really heartbreaking. And so my question to you is, why didn't Frazier ever call him out and say, this guy is supposed to be the great champion of equality and respect for people of color? So why is it okay for him to call me an animal and compare me to a gorilla? Why didn't that get criticized in real time?
Well, actually, he did. I mean, he did quite often. He argued with Ali, and he would say, how dare you call me ignorant? And of course, I don't smell, and all these other things. But look, Ali was a master of controlling the dialogue. He spoke in sound bites. These were at press conferences. He used poems and jokes to make his point. And it's really hard to be yelling for proper treatment and respect when you're dealing with somebody who handles the media so well. And he literally drowned out his complaints with humor, but cutting humor.
Yeah. It's just, like I said, you read the book and you just feel so terrible about how Frazier took all this to heart, that it really, really hurt him. And that's one of the interesting things about the book, because we see these guys getting beat up in the ring and they're so tough and they're so strong. And, you really bring out the internal turmoil that Frazier experienced in this relationship with Ali, where he became Ali's punching bag outside the ring,
Well,
verbally.
it's funny. One of the most important discoveries I made was about how resilient Joe Frazier was and his ability to accept and deal with loss, whether it was in the ring, whether it was, public ridicule, whether it was whatever it happened to be. He got so used to the idea of loss in his life and having to save face that he developed a strategy and a philosophy, that it ain't nothing but a party. You have to accept what happens to you. You have to live with it. You have to subsume it and come back and be ready to be renewed and start again. And I saw that time and time again with the way people treated him in public, with different slights that happened. And each time he seemed to handle it with an amazing amount of grace. And that's when I started to truly respect him. And I found that that was one of the things that I carried with me for a long time. After doing the reporting, I would have times in my life when I was embarrassed, when I didn't succeed at something I thought I should have succeeded at. And I would sort of channel Joe and his resilience and say, well, look, if he could come back from the things he could come back from, I could handle this, and it became inspirational.
That's neat. I want to get to another kind of layer of the book's narrative, and that has to do with Frasier's son, Marvis. Frasier was grooming Marvis to become a boxing champion. It never quite panned out. Give us the outlines of what happened, and I'm curious to know if you know what Marvis is doing these days.
Okay. Well, first of all, Marvis was really mistreated by history. And was a much better boxer and a much more successful boxer than people realize. First of all, in the amateurs, he was the #1 amateur heavyweight champion. He was the #1 amateur heavyweight in the United States for a long period of time. He lost a couple of fights near the end of his amateur career, but for a long time, he was undefeated. He was 54-0 and finished at 54-2.
Wow.
And then in the pros, he was 19-2. So he lost only 2 pro fights. The 2 pro fights he lost, one was to Larry Holmes when he was the heavyweight champion.
Wow.
He had won 44 straight fights in a row at that time. And had defended his title 20 times in a row. And Marvis fought him after only 10 pro fights. And that was Joe's mismanagement of Marvis, in his pro career. He put him in with Foreman way too soon. The other loss was to Mike Tyson in his prime. So you're talking about basically two top 10 boxers of all time. And he fought him when he was the #2 contender. He had just knocked out several people in a row. And Marvis had maybe 14 fights, to his record at that point. And if he had waited a year and a half and gotten more seasoning, he would have had more of a chance against it. So, he only lost those 2 fights. If he had stuck with his original manager, and if Joe allowed him to bring him along the way he had planned, Marvis would have likely wound up with a heavyweight championship. Maybe not the undisputed, but he would have been a heavyweight champion, I think.
So any idea what he's doing these days?
Oh yeah, he always was interested in religion. He always was interested in the ministry. For a long time after he left boxing, he was with a couple of different ministries, including a prison ministry. And they would travel around the country and deal with prisoners, and they would counsel them, and they would also help them to transition back into society.
Okay.
And of course, one of the great ironies of life occurred a few years after Marvis quit boxing. He was with the prison ministry, and he visited a prison in, I believe, Oklahoma. And Mike Tyson was one of the prisoners, in that cell. And Tyson refused to deal with the ministry, but when he found out that Marvis was one of the ministers, he specifically said that he would talk to Marvis, and they had a really lovely conversation. And Marvis wound up praying with him, consoling him, and giving him advice about transitioning, back into life. So, things work in strange ways.
Wow, that's interesting. Since this is a biography, why don't you tell us a little bit about Frasier's childhood and his upbringing and how he ended up in Philly? And I guess just as a side note, every time there's any reference to Rocky, I think of your book and feel like Frasier was cheated out of, that adulation and that,
Yeah, that was one
kind
of
of
his
symbolism, right?
Yeah, that was one of his pet peeves. Well, yeah, he felt, and it's funny because Jesse Jackson was the preacher at his funeral, and he gave a speech about that. He said Rocky was sort of made out of celluloid, and he had a statue built of him in Philadelphia, and he was idolized a certain way, and why didn't Joe get the same recognition, considering Rocky is based on Joe Frazier's career. And of course, several years later, unfortunately after he passed, a statue was built of Joe in front of one of the arenas in Philadelphia. And so he did sort of get his due, that way. As far as his childhood, it was a really interesting and very, very hard childhood. I mentioned he has a hard scrabble sort of past, and that was really what it was. He was the youngest of 13 children, which you mentioned before, and his father got into a serious accident and lost the use of his right hand. And Marvis was the child that volunteered literally to work with his father in the fields as his father's right hand. And so when other kids were going to school and socializing or whatever, he was working in the fields on their local farm and in other farms that they hired out, for or hired out on. He worked the cotton fields, he worked, picking different crops, and he helped his father every single day, which obviously caused him to grow up much faster than he normally would have. He was a tough kid, but he also was very conscious of looking out for the other Black kids his age and making sure they didn't get manhandled or picked on by the Black overseers. And on one farm where he worked, there was a Black kid who was about his age, and he was close to him, and the kid got beaten up by the overseer because he had used the tractor improperly and had damaged the tractor. And Joe went to the overseer and threatened him. He said, look, if you do anything like that again, I'm going to come after you. and the overseer threatened to beat him. And Joe stood up to him. And when he went home and told his mother about it, his mother was extremely worried and said that he has to leave home immediately. She was worried that he was going to be lynched, or possibly badly beaten. And he was 16 years old.
And just remind us of around what year are we talking?
Well, this was the end of the Jim Crow South, so Joe was 36 years old in 1980. So, he was born in 44, I guess, 43.
This was around 1960.
Yes, no, yeah. So this was about a little around 1960
in South Carolina.
in South Carolina,
Yeah.
rural South Carolina.
Okay.
And so Joe was forced to go to Harlem to live with a relative, and he left behind his girlfriend, who later became his wife, and she was pregnant. So he was already en route to being a father at the age of 15 and a half, 16. And he left for Harlem. He stayed in Harlem a little while. He realized that things were kind of tight for his family there. So he moved on to Philadelphia. He thought there was more work for him in Philadelphia. He got a job with a slaughterhouse. This picks up on the whole Rocky thing. He got a job as a drain man. He would be the one who would make sure that the blood ran off from the animals and down the drain and was cleared away. And he also started to get an interest in boxing when he was there. He was very overweight, and he really wanted to box, not to become a pro fighter or to become a fighter, but to lose some weight and get it back into shape. And the trainer that he worked with which was this guy Yancey Yank Durham, who wound up becoming his manager and was a very excellent one at that. He picked up on how well he could punch and how tenacious he was. And that was the beginning of training him to turn pro.
Interesting. All right. I am going to invite anybody who's listening, if you have questions for Glenn Lewis, think about what you want to ask. Go ahead and put them in the chat. I've got a couple more questions of my own, but I'm trying to fend off that awkward thing where I say, are there any questions? And then, there's nothing in there. Hopefully some of you out there want to, profess your interest in the Ali Frasier relationship. So I will look for any questions in a few minutes. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead with just a couple more of my own. I wanted to talk about Frasier's Olympic moment. If he hadn't won the gold there, would he have become as big a star as he was, do you think?
Well, it's ironic in a way because he got about as little boost to his career out of an Olympic gold medal I have ever heard of before. I mean, Ali went to the 1960 Olympic. He won the light heavyweight championship, and he came out. He had a syndicate back him right away of white and black businessmen, and he was set for life right from the beginning. Joe broke his hand at the Olympics in the semifinals. He actually broke his left hand, which he usually did his most damage with. And he had to literally fight right-handed for the whole championship, but he won the championship. But he was injured when he came back to the United States. And he actually lost his job in the slaughterhouse because he was injured,
Wow.
from the Olympics. And he started the syndicate refused to back him. There was a black syndicate that they had approached, and they refused to back him. They thought he was too small to be a successful heavyweight. So they started out just taking any fights that they could. Joe made what you call ticket money for the first 5 fights. He basically would get a bunch of tickets for the fight, and he would go out and sell tickets
Oh,
to
wow.
his own fight and keep the money from those tickets as his payment.
Wow.
And that's how, sort of desperate he was in the beginning. But he fought enough fights and won all of his, early fights. Obviously, he was undefeated, up until, the time he met Foreman, and like 29-0. So he won all those early fights, convinced the syndicate that he was viable, and eventually they came in and formed Cloverlay Syndicate, and they would pay him money to train and allow him to keep a certain percentage of the money that he won, and it sort of set him up for the rest of his career.
Okay, I see there are some great questions in there. I don't know if I just X'd my own picture out here. I'm looking at some of the questions in the chat, so I'm gonna go right to those. Why did Frasier give you the kind of amazing access that he did? How did that come about? That's from Judy Watson. Thanks, Judy. Great question.
Yeah, Judy always asks good questions.
Judy, you'll have to come to all of my other gigs.
I sort of had auditioned for him and Marvis previously. I had a different article that I was covering, and I needed 1 day of interviews with, at their gym with Joe and Marvis. And I just, I was in between Marvis's age and Joe's age. So I got along very well with Marvis, and I sort of hit it off with him during those that 1 day of interviewing. And Joe sort of like put up with me, during the interview. He didn't like some of my questions. I was a little pushy. I didn't listen to him some of the time. I was so concentrating on what I wanted to ask. But I think Marvis talked it up a lot and was talking about being comfortable dealing with the press, which he hadn't been before. Joe sort of gave me credit for that. So when it came time to do a longer access piece, he felt more comfortable that Marvis would be included.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. All right, let me see what's next in here. This is a good one. Why did you wait 40 years to open that closet? George Blecker asks. But you know what I want to know is, did you have a tape recorder that you could play those cassette tapes on, or you'd already transcribed this?
No, I had a tape recorder, obviously, and I had transcribed the tapes, very early on, and it also was syncing the notes to them as well. To be honest, for about several years after I did the interviews, I was convinced, and my agent was convinced, that I was going to be doing a made-for-TV movie based on that material. And I sort of started aiming towards, a film script and doing, doing that. But I didn't want to make Joe or the Frazier family feel that I was competitive with projects they had going on at different times. So the first time I sort of looked to do that was in the mid-90s, and Joe had just come out with his biography, which he had done with another writer, and the biography was getting a lot of play. And I didn't want Joe to feel that I was piggybacking on his, his situation. So I put it off for a while. And then when around the time that Joe passed away in 2011, I was, getting interested again in that. And I started to talk to people about it. And again, when Joe died, I'm sort of saying, gee, I don't really want to look like a ghoul that I'm going to be
Yeah.
piggybacking on his death. And of course, it just runs that way. Marvis had a book in 2013. He was a big part of this book or this, this film. So I sort of put it away again. And then when Ali died 5 years ago, I thought that would be the perfect time. But there was so much material that came out on Ali at that time that I felt that my book would have been lost in the shuffle. So finally, about 3 years ago, I looked ahead and I saw that the 50th anniversary of the fight of the century, the first Ali Frazier fight, would be in 2021 in March.
Right.
And that would be the 10th anniversary of Joe Frazier's death, which is November 7th, coming up right now. So I decided to do a book that would be aimed for 2021.
That makes a lot of sense. And, I was a journalist for 35 years. I've written a couple of books myself. There's probably a lot of journalists on our, among our listeners tonight, but I think most of us, at some point in our career, we cover something that is momentous in some way or, marks us in some way. And, I would bet a lot of us have those boxes in the closet for a couple of decades. And, you dream of writing a book and sometimes life gets in the way, or sometimes there's an opportunity that makes sense. And then you dig those notes out and you do it, or you don't. So
Well,
I'm glad that you did.
well, I really sort of feel that there's some good advice that I can give. I don't think you have to use material that's that rich right away. I don't think you have to write your book immediately. You shouldn't be pressured into doing it. Sometimes you have to take the time to think about the material, to think about the history that follows that material and how people view it looking back. And it changes the way you tell your story. It changes what's important in the story.
Agreed.
And I felt this happened, quite a bit. There was a lot of stuff that transpired over the years that added layers to the story.
Yeah.
Do I think you should wait 40 years to write the story? Hell no.
So a related question in the chat from Adam Shartoff. How long did it take to write the book? Adam also asks, what was the reason it took so long to release it? But I think you've kind of answered that. But that's a good question. I mean, once you sat down to do it, how long, from the time you excavated your notes, to the time you turned the manuscript in, how long did that take about?
All right, I think it's not only important how long I took, but how I spent the time. All right. The book, it took about 2 years from the time I discovered my notes to getting the book published. However, I spent purposely a whole year writing the book proposal. And what I did was I spent the bulk of that time writing a very detailed, with scenes and everything, chapter outline of the book. I wrote, pretty much fully realized scenes and I really set up the tone and the voice for the book by writing such detailed, chapter outlines.
Right.
So that when I finally signed to do the book, I told them that I could finish the book in 6 months.
Right.
And that, I was writing from, a half-written script.
Sure. And for folks out there who are thinking, about that book that's in a box in their closet that they want to write someday, I mean, that's a really important lesson. I mean, I found that writing the proposal for me was harder than writing the book. Once the proposal was done, it was easy to just fill in the blanks. So you got to take his class that he offers at the J School about how to write a book. All right, there's more questions. We're moving on to Ali. Yay. Okay, I'm going to read this one from Andrew Lipton. Although the media narrative, which has become historical, that Ali was the black man's favorite and Joe the white man's hero, not sure that's true. It seems to me more split between people who liked an outspoken, talented boxer versus people who liked a quiet, humble, hardworking, talented boxer. What do you think?
That's true, but true more recently than it had been previously. I think as people are getting removed from the current events of the Ali-Frazier rivalry and seeing it more as history, I think that people are more empathetic to Joe, and I think they see him as a spiritual man. He wasn't the greatest family man, but he cared desperately about his family, and he was a good father. And I think that they start to value those things in retrospect. And I think books like this that expose Joe's inner emotions and show how sensitive he was, and show how he internalized these comments and the rivalry, all add towards making him seem more human.
Yes.
And allows him a more low-key share of the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. The next question from Mark Blickley. Ali made public proclamations about feeling bad about his verbal abuse of Joe. Did he ever meet privately with Joe?
Yeah. There were several meetings near the end of Joe's life. Ali wanted to make up several years before, right after Joe had retired. There were several situations where Joe and Ali got invited to fights or to ceremonies or whatever, and where they were both being honored. And Joe would even refuse to be in the same room with Ali.
Wow.
So that sort of prevented any apologies. He was so adamant in his antagonism towards Ali that I didn't know Joe at the very end of his life and when he supposedly accepted Ali's apology. But I wrote in the book that I'm convinced that if he felt anywhere near the way he felt earlier on, when he accepted that apology, he had his fingers crossed behind his back, because Joe just could not reason out why Ali did these things. So I think, yeah, he gave lip service to accepting the Ali apology because he was being pressured to do so. But I don't think he ever was fully convinced.
Yeah, and who could blame him? I mean,
Yeah,
the hurt that he experienced, as you described it, it feels, you wouldn't blame him for feeling like he couldn't forgive this, that betrayal was what he experienced and he couldn't let it go. Let's see, we have a few more minutes and we can take another question or two.
Sure.
As if somebody wants to pop something in there, I'll look for it. In the meantime, I've got one more question to tide us over. The US boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics to protest the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
That would have been the right year for Marvis to go to the Olympics. And I'm just wondering, do you think that missing out on that opportunity cheated Marvis out of a possible break? I mean, you made it sound like Frasier didn't really get much of a bump, but Ali did. So what's your thought on that?
Well, first of all, the whole boycott of the Moscow Olympics was because Moscow did not make a deadline to withdraw their troops from Afghanistan that was given by Carter. and Carter insisted that if they don't make that deadline, there has to be some permanent,
Punishment, yeah.
thing, punishment for that. And he decided on the boycott. And Marvis was the number one heavyweight in the country at the time, and he supported the boycott. At least he gave verbal support. He was very patriotic. He said, "This is my country. This is what's right for my country. I will not, fight no matter what." And he supported that. On the other hand, his priority was more the Olympics than turning pro. Joe wanted him to turn pro. Joe wanted him to replace him as the heavyweight champion. Marvis wanted to go to the Olympics and wanted more than anything to have Joe and Marvis be the only father and son team to ever win a gold medal in the heavyweight boxing, division. And he felt that was really important. So when he found out that he wasn't able to go to the Olympics, he actually was pulling for and strongly suggesting that he would stay amateur for 4 more years and go to the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles because he desperately wanted to win that gold medal. Joe was the one who felt that that would be deadly to his career. George Benton, his trainer, also felt that he would be fighting inferior competition for a long time, and that would damage his progress, as a fighter. And both of them teamed up to sort of talk him out of that. So, in a way, he never got a chance to do what he wanted to do with his fighting.
Yeah. Mark Blickley comments in the chat. Sounds like an entire book should be written about Marvis. Maybe that can be your next next adventure.
Marvis was it's really surprising to have so much to write about a 19-year-old. I mean, usually there's not enough history, there's not enough, continuity. There's some very interesting 19-year-olds, so don't get me wrong, and I've taught a lot of them. But Marvis was an amazing situation because he grew up the son of a heavyweight champion. In these key fights that Joe had, the Thrill of Manila, the rematch, he was ringside. He had a running dialogue with Muhammad Ali. He had his own perspective on all of these situations, and he had a certain sophistication that sort of transcended Joe's bad advice.
Right. And he was also talented. I mean, there's lots of, actors and athletes and whatever, and they try to put their kids into the business and it just doesn't work out because they don't have it.
Right.
But he had it. He just, for whatever reason, the timing of the, pacing of his career just wasn't right, as you have described. Perhaps Frasier, the father, kind of mismanaged that. And I just wanted to throw in one thing, because, you also give a very nuanced portrait of Frasier's wife, Marvis's mother. We didn't talk about that and we don't really have time to do it, but it is an element of the book that I found quite fascinating, your sense of how she was approaching, what was going on with both her husband and her son, and the points at which she kind of separated herself from some of the decisions that were being made.
That's an important part of the book. Look, I decided that this is not, the truth is, this is not a boxing book. This is not a situation where you have to be very knowledgeable about boxing. In fact, I wrote this book with readers like you in mind. What I wanted was to expose the pressures the lifestyle, the priorities of not only Joe, but the people around him that grew out of his career, and show that it isn't all just the money and the fame. There is a difficulty in coping with one person's fame that impacts everybody around him. And I thought the way his wife handled their relationship, the way she handled the pressures of boxing, the way she obviously was uncomfortable with his fame. So the way she handled his fame, and the way she handled even, his indiscretions, while he was on the road, all took something out of her.
Yeah, and just for the record, let's say her name.
Yeah,
Say her name for the record.
I'm sorry. Dorothy. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
All right, we are out of time, but this has been a great conversation, and I'm so grateful for all the wonderful questions and comments that our audience put in the chat. They really took us into some, great little hallways and tunnels and points that I didn't have a chance to cover in my own questions. I wanted to thank Jennifer Dale, who helped us set this up from the J School. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you so much.
Jennifer's a hard working, she works full time. She has 2 little kids, so to take an hour out of her night on a weeknight, I salute you, Jennifer, and all the other moms out there. And thanks to the CUNY J School, Journalism School, Newark Graduate School of Journalism, and also to your college where you teach, Professor Lewis, for helping us to publicize this, get the word out, get the audience. The book is Sparring with Smokin Joe, Joe Frazier's Epic Battles and Rivalry with Ali. And if you haven't read it yet, I hope you go out and get a copy and dig into all the things that we referenced here tonight. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Professor Lewis.